Ahoy and welcome to Titanic Talkline. I am Alexia, and I'm excited to have on a friend of mine through the Titanic community that knows a lot more about anything that related to the ships than I ever will. It's Evgueni Mlodik, whose name I think I really just screwed up, even though he told me how to say it 12 seconds ago. Excuse me, I'm sorry. How are you,
Hi, I'm good. Yeah, the U is silent. It's just Evgeny.
Yevgeny? Yevgeny. I like that name.
I don't think that U is even supposed to be there. I think it was when I was when I was applying. Well, I wasn't the one applying. I was like nine. When I was
Right.
moving to the US, somebody transcribed my name into English and put a U in there, and I've been paying for it ever since.
Yeah, because I can see where I might do the Italian thing. There's a lot. There's the Italian names like Giuseppe, where Gui or Giu.
Guido.
Yeah, I kind of I looked at your name in it. I will admit that I assumed that it had to at least be like, if not outrightly pronounced, then like the U had to be acknowledged, touched in some way. Yevgeny. All right, I was wrong. Well, how are you? How are you doing? How goes it on this day?
No, I'm good. I'm good. Like I'm in the middle of moving, so my room looks really bare without all my ocean liner memorabilia that I had to pack away
Yeah, I'm
very,
very
very
sympathetic to
gingerly.
that. Yeah, I can imagine. He's like,
Mm.
anyone who doesn't know, you have a pretty extensive collection of Titanic everything, really.
Well, not. I
Not
mean,
everything, but it's
if I could afford like actual Titanic artifacts, I'd probably be too good for everyone.
well, I was it's
Yeah.
like I was gonna say like a pin collection, but you don't only collect pins, you know what I mean? It's like your
No,
your
no, I
interests were
don't.
vaster than that.
Yeah, pins are just nice. I promised to cut back, but then I saw there was a pin for Empress of Ireland for sale, and since she sank, it wasn't the cheapest pin, like when you get paintings of dead artists. But
Yeah, those.
I just had to have it. But no, yeah, I have a pretty large ocean liner collection. I mean, I'm not gonna like humble brag about it.
I
It's like
think you
I'm
should.
proud of it, but it's nowhere near as extensive or expensive as I've seen some other people have. But like I have some stuff I'm proud of. I have some, I have a Demitasse from the Lusitania, or more likely Mauritania. The jury's still out on that. A Demitasse, that's like a small coffee cup with a saucer.
Thank you. I didn't know
The
what that was.
reason it could be either only from Lusitania or Mauritania is, and I wish I could show it, but it's packed away, is because it was there were it was the design of the cup and the saucer is something that was only used on the Veranda Cafe for Lusitania and Mauritania. That pattern was used around 1907, and the only Cunard ships that had a cafe, like a Veranda Cafe, were Lusitania and Mauritania. By the time Aquitania was built, it also had like some Veranda cafes. They already changed what the cups look like. So it could have only come from that time period. And some people I mean, those actually do pop. Those pop around like the demitasse and the saucer pretty often for like rare memorabilia. So people do buy. I've seen other people have them, and like they drink espresso out of it. And I'm just terrified. Like I don't use any of my like dinnerware that I got from ocean liners. Uh, I'm terrified to even like approach the subject. Like I'm never gonna use them for to drink tea out of or
I don't
coffee.
I don't know if I would or I would. Like, part of me likes to think that if I got something from, an ocean liner that was of my interest, that I would, like, half of me thinks that I would keep it in a nice case or just nicely on a shelf somewhere where I could look at it and it would be pretty and never touched. And the other half of me thinks that I would have the mentality of life's too short, do it anyway, and I would use it.
Well, yeah. Well, for example, like sometimes like I even go like to like even if it wasn't really on the ocean liner. If it's like ocean liner adjacent, I already don't want to use it.
Right.
For example, I bought this Edwardian era Cunard tea tray, like a wooden tea tray that would have
Ooh.
been used on like Lusitania or Mauritania, but maybe it was from the Aquitania or some of the smaller ships, like you know, I don't know, Caronia, Carmania,
Hmm.
the Carpathia, probably not. And it looked kind of naked and barren just sitting on my shelf. So I
Hmm.
decided to find like a Cunard type tea set. I couldn't find anything, and I got some pointers that Cunard at the time, Cunard wasn't really like commissioning their own like China patterns like White Star Line.
Hmm.
So if I could find like a a Tuscan, not from Italy, Tuscany. Tuscan was a name of a manufacturer of like porcelain in
Huh.
the UK, or England. I don't know what it was. It was in the Edwardian era. Was it Britain, England? In
I
any
have no
case,
idea.
English. Let's just say English. So it was an English manufacturer, and they told me if I could find like an old tea set from Tuscan with like big floor patterns, I will pretty much find like a Lusitania tea set. And
Sure.
yeah, I found one on Etsy that was perfect, and I put it on the tray, and it's never going to be like used for tea ever again.
Hmm. I think that's
And
fair.
surprise, yeah, and like surprise, surprise, it was sold by it was being sold by a Russian woman. It's like a stereotype that Russian women have this obsessive fixation on vintage antique tea sets. I don't think it's a stereotype in the U.S., so it was funnier in my head. I'm sorry.
It's a stereotype for a certain kind of like American girls. There's like this whole there's a bunch oh my gosh. There's a bunch of like aesthetics abound, and I think one of them like cottagecore, I think it's the name. I don't know. I could be making it up, but I'm pretty sure that that's part of it is like vintage teacups, or is it like I don't know, romantic? I don't know anything.
I mean, it's all. I mean, it's very romanticized. I mean,
Yes.
I'm not the one to judge how romanticized the past is. I think just about any ocean liner fan, because
Hmm.
none of us could probably afford to go in first class on any of those ships.
No. I mean, I could afford to get not an interior room on a cruise ship, but like,
It's
yeah.
just find it funny, like through social media, like people are arguing whether Titanic or the Lusitania had the nicer first class lounge, and I'm
Hmm.
just thinking it's so hilarious because it's like, what's the point of even arguing this? If chances are, if you were alive at the time, you would have not even come within like a, a four deck radius of that lounge.
I think that that's actually really interesting. And for people who don't know Yev, he knows so much about liners and about the time period around it. And, as you just mentioned, with things being romanticized, not to bring up the Cameron film 14 seconds into this interview, but one of the things
Hit me.
here, but one of the things that I think that was portrayed in the movie that is weirdly historically inaccurate, but yet is such a common trope, is that, class transcendence romance. And, for the sake of a movie, you kind of have to suspend your disbelief of certain things, but the class barriers of the time are really hard to explain because we don't really have the same. We don't. I mean,
We
at
don't
least
have that mentality, and
yes.
when you watch, and it's not just the James Cameron movie, it's
No.
almost all Titanic films. They're made with like decades worth of hindsight, and the writer. I mean, I'm not blaming the writer or the
No.
director
Sure,
because
sure,
it is
sure.
what it is. Yeah. They're projecting their own bias, their own worldviews, which is what any director would do. So
Right.
you can't really. I think the closest you could grasp for like a societal, like how, and like I mean, it's gonna sound cliche that I am kicking myself for saying it, but like the best movie to portray that probably would be A Night to Remember. I know everybody
Hmm.
always says Night to Remember is the best thing and everything, and it's the best Titanic movie that was ever made, and no other movies should have been made, and all the other movies made before Night to Remember should be burned. I'm not like that.
Me neither.
Yeah, but I just think since it was made so like relatively close to the sinking,
Hmm.
and it was such a British film,
Yeah.
just please don't look at the director's filmography after like 1968
Excuse me, I'm just gonna do that right now.
yeah, because after that he was just making erotic horror films. Vampire Lovers, Dr. Jekyll, Sister
Yes.
Hyde. He sort of, I
Let's
don't know what happened, but his career took a nosedive. Roy Ward Baker. But we're not talking about him. We're talking about A Night to Remember, how, like, there was
we
just
might
this
be talking
kind of,
about Roy Ward Baker for the
we're
rest of
talking,
this.
well, hey, I got a lot of his movies on Blu-ray. I mean, his movies are like, all the movies he made for Hammer, was, because, when we think of Hammer horror, tangent time. When we think of Hammer horror films, those 50s, 60s British horror films, we think of like really classy gothic film, like films about Dracula and Frankenstein.
Hmm.
But around like 1970, they kind of went really raunchy with their films because they were trying to compete with American exploitation films.
Interesting. That
Mm.
interesting here because I'm reading it just I brought up the wiki really quickly and it actually mentions that it says I'm paraphrasing. He worked for TV during the 60s and 70s, directing episodes of The Avengers, The Saints, Champions, all of them created with an eye on the American market.
Hmm. That was, yeah, the British film industry was sort of collapsing in the early 70s, and they were trying to make their movies really marketable to the US because in a weird roundabout way, the reason they were collapsing to begin with is because a lot of American studios who were investing in their films, like giving them distribution deals and everything, they left.
Mm,
They left all the British indie studios. So they were pretty much on their own with no money. All the money was with the American studios and they left. So they were
gotcha.
basically showing as they were trying to bring back the American audience, like the American money by showing, see, we can make American style movies, just please give us money.
And now Americans love nothing more than British TV.
Oh yeah, it's the classiest thing that ever classied in the history of
Ex
classiness.
exactly.
Downton Abbey
Downton
and
Abbey.
everything else that's like
Uh,
Downton Abbey.
yep, Bridgerton was the latest. I didn't watch Bridgerton, but people were like dying for
Is it
Bridgerton.
even British or is it like an American show posing as British?
It's the latter of the two, but it very
Hmm.
much kept in keeping with, that very lavish British style of TV making. It may have even it was a Netflix show, so Netflix shows can be, produced and co-produced internationally. So it
Oh
but
yeah,
it
they got a ton of international shows.
yeah, but it was definitely I think made mostly by Americans. But yeah, it had a lot of the vestiges that are popular in excuse me that Americans like in British cinema. But to go to bring you back to A Night to Remember, which is where you wanted to
Mm.
stay. Um,
Yes.
I the reason that people bring up A Night to Remember so often for any of my listeners who don't know or who haven't seen it yet is that it was it is probably the most, it's not completely, it's not a documentary, but it is probably the most historically, sociologically accurate
Exactly.
movie. Yeah.
It's the I even watch it for like not even for the historical accuracy, the dubious historic because it's not as historically accurate as people would like to think it is. And
Sure.
I'm not just talking about the ship not breaking in half because nobody knew. Well, people knew it broke in half, but it wasn't like an official. The official, for all intents and purposes, both inquiries stated the ship sank intact. So
Hmm.
I don't really care about any Titanic movie that's made pre 1985. That where the ship sinks in one piece.
Right.
It just comes with the territory. But I'm just saying there are
Hmm.
other things about that weird things in that movie that aren't accurate.
Oh,
But
sure.
the socio-political type of like is I always felt was spot on. There is no like third class are not like self and not like most Titanic films have this issue with third class being just way too self-aware how they're poor and being mistreated. It's almost like the entire it's like the entire third class was like radicalized by Karl Marx almost in some of the Titanic movies. And just I mean, I'm sure there were some people into that on board. It's like 700,
Yes,
710, about 700. I want to be too pedantic because I don't remember. There were over 700 passengers in third class the on
sure.
voyage, and I'm sure some of them were kind of into that stuff.
Totally,
But
totally.
like having all these characters preach about how evil the rich people are, and they're being oppressed, like that sort of just that it's just very anachronistic to assume that would have been like a theme on board. And for example, Julian Fellows. I think both the Julian Fellows. I know you love that one. I think both the Julian Fellows miniseries and the '96 miniseries are. I call them like peak Titanic fiction because
Huh, okay.
they embrace every single cliche, every single urban myth, and they just run with it. Like they revel in all like the fake news is like they just revel in all the like. Let's just look at Julian Fellows for a second. Like everybody's just so miserable on that ship. I know it
Oh,
wasn't a cruise
everyone.
ship. I know it wasn't a cruise ship, but but it's I just refuse to believe that people just spent the entire 7 day voyage, well, cut short, complaining and whining and bitching about like, oh my god, I don't like Irish people. Oh, the poor.
They're
Oh, the rich.
Catholics.
Oh yeah, yeah, Catholic. Like, is that like did the people really have nothing better to talk about? It's like can you imagine if you and I, let's say, we'll go on a princess cruise? Oh well, no, we're poor. If we go on a carnival cruise, no, we're poor. Norwegian.
Okay.
We're gonna go
All right.
Norwegian.
All right.
So, and then 100 years later, somebody makes a movie about our trip,
Mm-hmm.
and the actors playing us are just sitting like drinking, I don't know, margaritas instead of tea because it's a cruise.
Of
So we're
course.
just sitting there in the lounge or whatever in the bar drinking, and according to the filmmaker, all we want to talk about is the upcoming 2024 election, the Ukraine Russia conflict,
How much
and
we don't like the people at the table with us.
yeah, how much we had the people at the table with us, and yeah, that's literally all we talk about. Like nobody's even having fun. I mean, like
No.
Titanic once again wasn't a cruise ship, but you think somebody would be like, "Oh, I went to the Café Parisien and the Windsor tour was amazing." That's a reference to a Titanic video game. Or like, did you go to the Turkish baths? Those electric baths are weird. Like that was such a weird
Hmm.
experience. You'd think somebody would talk about that, but no, they're talking about, I don't know, the Kaiser, going into the Balkans, or I'm just
And
off the top of my head.
and it was interesting now that you mention it that again, and this comes with the fact that as you were saying, these shows are made with a lot of hindsight, but the two of the principal female characters in that show spend a lot of time talking about Irish politics.
That was just here's yeah that's actually my issue with that character of the wife of the Lady Manton. Like
Yes.
we hate her like all 4 episodes, but then we're suddenly we're supposed to like her because she goes, by the way, I knew you were cheating on me all along, but being a strong, resilient woman, I tolerated it.
Yeah, hashtag
That was
boss
like such
babe.
yeah, like, and then like, and what's next? We're gonna buy some MLM from you, like what do you want? Like, well, that was such a weird. That was so obviously written by a man because no woman will ever react like that.
No, there was a bunch of dialogue between
But what
her and the other and the oh gosh.
the secretary's wife, they were
Yes.
both completely insufferable. But then in the last episode, just because like they had like a little epiphany, we're supposed to find them sympathetic. That's not how character development works. You can't just throw something at the screen like 10 seconds before the climax. But what I was going to say about her, what I never understood about her character is if she didn't want to be known being like, was it like half Irish or North Irish or whatever she was, then why spend the entire trip not shutting up about the Irish?
I know. It's like if I didn't want anyone to know that I was half Indian, for example, it'd be my biggest secret. I pretend like I didn't know what that country was. Be like, oh,
Oh,
have you
like
ever had
that
an Indian?
actress.
Yeah, have you never had
Have you
Indian
heard
food?
of?
What is that?
Have you ever heard of Merle? I can't. I hope I'm not butchering her name, Meryl Oberon. She was a Hollywood actress.
No.
She was half Indian. She was half
Mhm.
British, half Indian. And being half Indian was like her dirty, dark secret. And she never even mentioned the country while she was working in Hollywood. Like it was a completely like a forbidden topic. Nobody knew that she was half Indian.
You
So it kind
know,
of drives your point home.
there's a lot of you go back to these time periods. She was born in 1911. I just looked her up, and
Hmm.
this also happened. You'll see with I'm talking only about America, but for people who ended up having mixed race children during the time before segregation, or having children
Definitely.
with indigenous people, if you could pass as white, a lot of people really would, because if you're able to just get away from ethnic roots in those time periods, your life would be a lot easier, because even if you didn't look native, or you didn't look black, or you didn't look Indian, like I looked up a picture of Merle, and it's like, you look not white, but I don't know what with, if you didn't tell anyone. And if you were able to get away with that in those time periods, there was a large percentage of people who would, simply because otherwise you were literally delegated as a second class person.
Mm. There, I mean, and there's a lot of stories in Hollywood that people don't really remember now, but there was
Yep.
also Universal Films were grooming a new star. Not grooming as we know now, the word, like grooming as in they were like, building her up to become the next star. And her name was Aquanetta, and she was presented as this Venezuelan exotic beauty from like Latin America, and she was going to be the big new exotic movie star. And then they discovered she was actually a woman named Mildred Davenport from like upstate New York who was black, passing for white, and they just demolished her. They buried her career.
Yeah, and it's, we're talking about this in 2023, so of course we're talking about it with
Mm.
light-fingered disdain, like how dare we do that? But like, people still unfortunately get treated like that now. I mean, in many cases it's not quite as obvious, but I looked up Aquanetta, and she was from Pennsylvania. Just
Oh,
this one
in
says
that area.
Pennsylvania, but it also says South Carolina. So, I mean, yeah, just someone who, wanted
Let's just
her
say East
origins
Coast.
unknown. Yeah, I mean, it didn't, she
Mhm.
didn't, it didn't matter, but she decided to distance herself from being Arapaho because she knew that you can't safely be Arapaho in the 40s and be successful like that, which sucks, but it was
Yeah,
true.
she was beautiful. I'm not going to say she was the best actress, but she never really got a chance to even like shine. She only made a couple of awful like B horror movies, like low tier horror, like Universal horror movies,
Hmm.
where she played a captive ape woman.
Yeah,
It's
I
don't
see
even.
that
I'm not
here.
even gonna. Yeah, and she was actually she. By the time they made the third movie, she was already fired, so she was in the last one. So I can't really judge how good of an actress she was, but yeah, I thought the few movies I've seen of her, she was beautiful. I can see how she would pass for like South America. She would have
Hmm.
been. I mean, it's still kind of creepy that she was like kind of being fetishized, like they do with these like dark Latin ladies.
Hmm.
But at least like, she thought it was like the lesser of two evils. But then somebody exposed her anyway, and her career suffered. But
It
once again, we're.
is.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was just saying we're gonna go back to Titanic. Are
Mhm.
you ready to go back to the Titanic?
Are you ready to go back to Titanic? I am.
You know, you know the
Huh?
the thing with the romance in the James Cameron film about it wasn't just a class issue that it was impossible for it to happen. It's that they were like breaking every single American immigration law on what do you call it? Uh, Not segregation. I just had that word. Quarantine. Quarantine.
Ah,
Can you
okay.
remember? Can you believe I forgot that word? Like, how could anybody forget that word?
It's almost as though
Uh,
we had it tattooed on our palms over the
I
COVID.
swear, the past couple of years, the beverage bug. So, third class during that time period was strictly segregated, especially when going from Europe to America. Not just
Oh.
because it was like a class issue. The third class passengers had to be processed through Ellis Island through their quarantine check to see if any
Ah.
communicable diseases. It does sound very degrading, But to be fair, there were a lot of awful diseases like that was not
There
that
were.
were they're not preventable, but lower class, even upper classes, like typhoid. The story of Typhoid Mary.
Mm-hmm. But that is
Um,
such a gross story. I don't want to get
it's
too much into it.
disgusting.
Yeah, I don't want to
I
get
know.
into it on this channel, but for anyone who is not familiar, Yev, do you want to give them like the 30-second tail end of Typhoid
Yeah, let's just say that that story is the reason
Mary?
why every time I see peach flavored ice cream, I run screaming into the night. Uh,
Why did
okay, so Mary,
it's
basically the colloquial slang typhoid Mary is for a person that infects people without knowing it. And
Mhm.
there was an Irish woman in like the early, I think it was, I may be wrong.
I
It was
think
like
I'm
1904 or 1905.
not 100%
Uh,
sure, but
it
let me
was
look that
it
up.
was like very early 19. It was already the 1900s, but very early, like right after the end of the Victorian era. So she
Mary
was a young
Mallon
woman.
was born in
Hmm.
1869 and she emigrated to the United States in 1884.
But when did the
Um,
outbreak started? Because it was
let's
so she
see.
wasn't that young. She was kind of she just got up
1907 is
there.
when the detective started to get suspicious and started to look into
Okay,
her.
because I saw photos of her in it might have been retouched, like Alice Cleaver, but I saw photos of her in quarantine. She looked nice for her age. I thought she was younger. But anyway, back on Mary Mellon. She was a woman who worked as a cook. She was a really good cook. Actually, she was popular with wealthy families. She was an Irish immigrant, and no one knew. It was actually discovered that this can even happen with her. She was an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid
Yeah.
fever, and she suddenly, like every single family she worked for as a cook would drop dead from typhoid,
Yeah.
like every single family member. And like people thought, like, well, what exactly is she even cooking? Well, doesn't it only happen with raw foods? Then turns out her big specialty was peach flavored ice cream, which is
Correct.
cold.
Yes.
And she was serving her. She was hired literally as a dessert chef just for her peach flavored ice cream. And the detective who like exposed her, he even asked her, "Do you even wash your hands like before you cook?" She was like, "Not all the time. Is that
Hmm.
necessary?" Like wash your hands after the bathroom because you get typhoid from from feces.
Fecal matter.
That's what makes it so disgusting, even more disgusting. And they kept arresting her, and she kept promising that she would not work as a cook, but then she couldn't find a decent job, like because nothing paid as well as being a cook for the working class. So she went back to
Hmm.
being a cook using different aliases. So finally, it was a bit of a controversial court decision, but she was forcibly quarantined for the rest of her life.
Yeah.
And
And
when she,
I was just gonna say, for anyone
oh,
who thinks that that's a joke, Yev was serious. They basically told her, like, we will not do anything to you. You just cannot be a cook anymore. And she kept disregarding that and continuing to infect people. And that is why they ultimately put her in quarantine.
and she sort of she kind of used that old excuse of like, oh, you just hate me because I'm Irish. You don't want me to like make a living because I'm Irish. And they're like, no, it's got nothing. I mean, she did have a point. The anti-Irish
Yes.
sentiment was horrible at the time. People don't remember, but
Yes.
Irish people were treated like crap in the U.S. And her story didn't really help. It kind of contributed to the
No.
propaganda that Irish people are disgusting and they bring disease. So she had a point when she was saying you're just persecuting me. But yeah, after they forcibly circum after, oh my God, I'm sorry. Freudian slip. After they forcibly quarantine her, she lived for like a couple of more. She lived until old age, and when she died,
Hmm.
and they autopsied her, she still had live bacteria, like live
Yes.
typhoid in her system.
Yes, and the whole thing with Typhoid Mary, I'm sorry, Mary Mallon, that's her real name, was that
Hmm.
she, as you have said, was asymptomatic. So she never contracted typhoid, which was her whole argument was how can I be making people sick? I have never been sick. And I'm remembering now at one point in time that I believe the detective, his name is George Sober, he's the one who originally started looking into her. He was trying to get her to give him like a sample of her saliva so he could test it for typhoid, and she refused. So anytime they tried to do something to confirm if she was the infected one or put some guidelines in place to stop her infecting people, she would absolutely barricade them. So when she died, they did an autopsy to confirm, and it was true that she was the carrier of typhoid. But as you said, it lent into like for her, I'm sure she felt very much like it was just persecution for being Irish. She wasn't sick. And with typhoid being extremely contagious and very has a lot of very intense symptoms, it's easy to kind of see where she's coming from. But yeah, her stubbornness ultimately landed her in quarantine for the rest of her life, which is that's a hard way to live for anyone. I think you're muted there, Yev.
How's this? I'm sorry.
Gotcha.
Okay. So as I was saying,
Quarantining
with
because of going
her,
through Ellis
yeah,
Island, that was
quarantine.
the need.
Yes. Sorry, I keep going on these tangents. So,
That's what the
Mary
show's
Mallon is a
for.
good example. Yeah, Titanic tangents. Uh, Tangents of Titanic
That's
proportions.
a better name.
So the reason Mary Mallon's story is kind of a reason why they had that in place. That third class had to be strictly segregated because they had to go through a disease check at Ellis Island. And let's be honest, people in first and second class paid extra not to do that. So
I
if
was gonna ask why not? I mean, obviously, I'm sure the answer is pretty obvious in there, but like first class, quote unquote, makes sense. They're rich, they're famous. Why would they have disease?
Mhm.
But second class wasn't subjected to the same scrutiny.
No, they weren't. In fact, there were
Oh,
a lot of a lot of immigrants who were like, if you can afford to go second class, do the best you can to go second class. You have to be like tortured through Ellis Island.
gotcha. Interesting. Interesting.
There was even like I used to read like some from some like some like well like some stories about some Jewish immigrants who were like very proud how like my great grandfather he brought us his family here in second class, not third. And
Hmm.
I realized that like it's on a whole new level. Realize, well, now that I know about the quarantine and all that good stuff.
I mean, it makes sense.
So so basically, if Jack would have really like, no matter how rich or influential Cal and Rose were, that they demanded Jack would go to visit them in first class for dinner, that would have just been completely not allowed. That would have been illegal. The ship would have been like banned from entering New York Harbor, or at best, like the whole ship would have ended up being quarantined. And everybody, even the first class passengers, would be forced to go through that disease check at Ellis Island, and that would have been like the world's worst like advertisement for White Star Line.
What
That
a
the first class
process.
passengers, yeah, have to go through a disease check. So that would have been
Rich
just a
people
big,
treated like
yeah.
humans.
It's yeah. So I mean, but I mean, let's be honest. I'd be pissed too if I would have boarded.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sailing first class. I'm clean as far as I know because I mean, for not by 1912 standards, let's say I bathe
Sure.
twice a week. Like I'm guaranteed not to like that. I don't need Ellis Island, and then because some like teenage girl going through an existential crisis brings her like one night stand over for dinner in the dining room, now I have to pay for it, like with my like with like nerves and delayed time. That instead of just getting off the ship, I have to be like ushered to Ellis Island and be checked for like I don't know for scurvy or I don't know
Can,
leprosy.
can you
It
imagine if we on our carnival cruise suddenly got an announcement that we all had to pass through some station in the Florida Keys because a girl in a balcony suite invited a boy from an interior room to dinner?
That would have been that. See, that's pretty much the modern equivalent of
It
what we're
is,
talking about.
and it sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud because, we can picture it. There's not literal class barriers on a carnival cruise. I'm laughing
Oh,
because
if
I'm
you think,
picturing it. But I mean, there weren't literal class barriers on Titanic in the way that some people imagine. There weren't wrought iron gates that were fastened with a padlock to
the
keep
boss,
everybody
yeah,
out.
Boss Street Gates,
Yeah,
which
but they,
I think I figured out where that myth came from. I think I
oh,
was able to pinpoint it,
okay.
and you'll be surprised by that. I mean, rumors that they were kept below existed, but there was never really like a concrete visualization of like a Bostwick gate, like in front of a staircase leading to the boat deck.
Right.
That never existed until A Night to Remember.
Oh.
There was a scene in A Night to Remember, which I'm sure was meant to be more like a condensed dramatic license to show like a gist of how difficult it was for most third class passengers to get up to the boat deck,
Sure.
and to give like to show it all in just one scene. They have some third class passengers who we were following for most of the film. They get to the second class staircase, which is already like a clue that this would could not have happened because second class staircase would not have had those gates.
Right.
In one of the landings of the second class staircase, there is a Bostwick gate, and they have to chop down the lock.
Oh
And
yeah.
they chop the lock, they break the lock, the Bostwick gates, they retract because that's what the Bostwick gates are. They're like little accordion. Um,
Hmm.
And Titanic didn't even have any. It did have them. It had them in crew only areas for where passengers were off limits. But they never had them in passenger areas, especially areas leading to the boat deck. And they wouldn't have had it on the stair in the middle of a stairwell. That's that. So it's that little brief scene, and I to remember did for artistic license just to bring home a point was suddenly taken for granted. And going forward, all Titanic movies have a stupid Boston Gate scene in them.
Yeah, it I think it was when I was talking to Stephen Beale when he was pointing out that like the gates for the most part were in people's heads.
It was okay. So I'm not gonna try to whitewash anything.
Please
Yes,
don't.
some passengers were kept below. The stewards didn't allow some of them to go up, but it wasn't like a malicious, like, we have to kill the poor people to make room for the rich people. It was never about that. It was all just the worst possible communication skills, no organized evacuation. The stewards in third class were literally the last ones to even know the ship was sinking. Like, they weren't just going to let people go up without knowing that there's an emergency. So yeah,
Yeah.
early on in the sinking, they were told they were not letting people go up, but as soon as they realized the gravity of the situation, they started letting people go. But then, people didn't want to. There was a lot of the third class passengers had this. I forgot what it's called. It's kind of like a bystander syndrome. They were just waiting for orders from like higher ups. They were so used to like wealthy landowners or the government officials to tell them what to do without somebody telling them where to go and how to go. They wouldn't go. They would just stand there. They would just stand there waiting.
I think this
And
also
other
goes to, sorry, not to interrupt, but I think it also goes to the part where, the we've now realized that there's different responses to like panic. It's not just fight or flight. There's also one of them is
Mhm.
also freeze. And I can imagine that that was probably a response of a lot of people.
It was, and also remember, this is all hindsight. We know now that getting in those lifeboats was safe,
Right.
and that a ship was coming to rescue them. Those people didn't.
Right.
They didn't know that, like, because as Don Lynch said it several times, the common thing back then was that if a ship sinks, everybody dies. There was no like precedent with a big well, except the sinking of the Republic. There was no precedent of a large rescue operation like getting everybody off the ship. It was just kind of felt like getting into a lifeboat is just delaying the inevitable.
Right. Well, you would get
There,
into a lifeboat when you could see another ship, typically. It was like, aha, now it's time for
exactly.
us to get from here to there. They were more of they were more like conveyors and less of
There
like,
were ferries.
yes, there we
Yeah,
go.
they that's why oh my god, there was not enough lifeboats. But why wasn't there not enough lifeboats? Was it because they thought it was unsinkable and they were just dismissive of that? Maybe like somewhere deep inside in their hearts. But yeah, no, not really. In reality, it was taken for granted that lifeboats were not meant to hold the entire complement of a ship,
Yeah.
all of the people, and
Yeah.
wait for rescue. That was just unfathomable.
Yeah.
The idea was that a rescue ship arrives and the lifeboats will start ferrying people back and forth to the rescue ship. It was
Hmm.
the Republic, a much smaller, older White Star Line ship, sank 3 years prior. It got um, it got T-boned by a small like immigrant ship.
Yeesh.
I forgot the name. Florida, I think.
That
or
tracks.
Vespa,
If
something
it's
like
called
that.
Florida.
Yeah, it was an Italian. It was an Italian ship, though. It was like kind of like how Germany would name their ships after American presidents, so that people would be like, "Oh, this will give us easier time to get into America."
I didn't know that,
So
but
yeah,
that's great.
yeah. Oh yeah. If you look at all these like American German ships, President Washington, not
Oh, that's
President George Washington Coolidge. It's hilarious. So so as I was saying, when in 1909, RMS, what was it, SS? I don't know if it had the name, probably aren't. Anyway, the Republic was T-boned by a small, like, Italian ship, and it killed, I think, like, it killed a couple of people, like with Andrea Doria, but everybody else was rescued. It stayed afloat for like 12 hours, and the Baltic just came in time, plenty of time to get everybody off the ship, who didn't
Mm.
get squished in the T-boning. And it was seen so successful. They used the wireless. It was the first time SOS was sent. Not Titanic, it was the Republic, but still a White Star Line ship.
Right.
So after the Republic sank, I was just taken for granted that this is how every single shipwreck is going to go going forward. Nobody pictured that there would be a coal strike with so few ships around, and that a giant new ocean liner will be all on its lonesome, like in the middle of the ocean, on a fairly well traveled route that usually would have a lot of ships, and that they would sideswipe an iceberg, which is just sedimentary rock,
Yeah.
and expose half of the ship, to the ocean. That was just completely unfathomable that this would even happen, and that everybody would have to get off the ship and wait for rescue.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all hindsight. Like once again, like it wasn't just third class passengers. Many passengers just didn't think that getting into a lifeboat would have been much better option than what they had on the ship. And what's even funnier is the scene where somebody chops down a door to rescue another passenger,
Hmm.
or handcuffs. It's always applied to a third class passenger. We've seen that recreated in the 1943 version, 1997 version, A Night to Remember. I think it's also in the Julian Fellows miniseries.
It's not
But
third class passengers, it is crew, but yes,
oh right, the one that
the
Bruce Sisley
Italian
just
crews.
casually decided to commit mini genocide.
Yeah,
Um. So
we
yeah.
don't need meatballs anymore.
Yeah. Italian people. Yeah, they can just go to their water. But anyway, Davy Jones Locker. So in reality, that did happen on Titanic with a first class passenger. A passenger in first class got stuck in his cabin, the door got jammed. And I think it was, once again, whoever wants to call me out and call me a fake historian, for getting this wrong only the
Mm.
first time. I think it might have been Norris Williams who did it. He heard the guy screaming in his cabin, and he grabbed an emergency like fire axe and he chopped down the door to get him out. And that's when the steward approached them and started telling them that they're going to have to pay a fine for it.
Nice.
So it's
I
funny how that actually happened in first class, but it's always applied to third and crew in Titanic films.
I know I just now remember that it is also again in the Julian Fellows show, more like you were pointing out, except instead of a man in his own cabin, it was a the
The
Manton's
maid,
maid. Yes.
yes.
She went back to go get something and got locked in the first class cabin, and then the footman butler male attendant showed up and like tried to break down the door, and then a steward came up, was like, "You're gonna break that," and unlocked it.
And her story is actually that's combined from two different situations. One is that one is the R. Norris Williams fire axe story, and the other one, if you can Google this for me,
Yeah.
there was a man traveling with his mother and sister, and he had his mistress on board that he wanted to propose to, and like introduce her to them after they got off in New York. I forgot what their names were. Um, they had like a really nice suite on B deck.
This wasn't the Burr. Oh, Gertrude
No, no,
Maybelle
no.
Thorne. She was the
I
mistress of
think
George Rosenshine.
I think that who was with his mother and sister on board.
Yes, it
Yeah, that's
says
them.
George, his mother and sister had emigrated from Hamburg as hold on here. He boarded Titanic because his companion was his mistress.
Yes, that's the guy.
Yeah,
Anyway, the mistress got accidentally locked in her cabin, and but like it wasn't like a huge deal. She started screaming, and the steward immediately let her out.
that makes sense. I mean, if I heard someone screaming, I'd also let them out.
But if you ever watch this terrible, terrible, terrible documentary called Titanic, A Curiosity What Sank the Titanic, an iceberg, the end. It's like this really awful, over dramatized, sensationalized like reenactment on the sinking,
Mm-hmm.
and it covers their story, with like actors, and it's just completely blown out of all proportion. How she's locked in her cabin, and there's water flooding in, and then the porthole breaks, and water starts gushing in, and her lover is racing against time to get her, like before her stateroom floods. It was just and then as they're running up the stairs, they get like swept up, a la Jack and Rose, they get swept off by the waves. And then soaking wet, they finally get onto the boat deck and he can get onto the last lifeboat. That is just the most biggest pile of, as Jack Dawson says, horse shit like ever. It also and the kind of the language that documentary uses is just so lurid, and the water begins overtaking the ship. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
as in flooding? No, it's overtaking the ship.
Okay, ma'am, as you say.
Man, this is a Wendy's.
Ma'am, this is a Wendy's indeed.
So yeah, it's terrible, but I think it's the only Titanic like dramatization to feature that family,
Person.
that couple. Yeah, and Julian Fellows kind of perverted it into his horrible, horrible, horrible miniseries. You
Hearing
know,
those two retellings, I don't hate the fact that he combined those two stories into one plot line.
I guess no,
But I
no,
mean,
you have
I
a good
hated the
point.
show.
Yeah, the show in general. Like, here's my biggest issue with that show is that it got so much hype. How
Hmm.
it's going to be the most historically accurate show, like dramatization of the Titanic disaster. It's going to be much more accurate than James Cameron. Well, I mean, they never said the James Cameron version out loud. If you ever watch interviews, they always kind of tap dance around it.
Hmm.
Um, there was just so much hype about it being so accurate, but I think one of the issues was that ITV cut their budget.
That's what I've heard.
uh by the time like the final product came out, it was soul crushing. It looked cheap, it
It
looked
is
cliche,
awful.
it was a rehash of like everything. I think the only reason it's done in this weird, Rashomon style that doesn't really add anything, how it always jumps back to the main voyage and then it goes back to like from another character's point of view
It's so
every
obnoxious.
episode. It was really obnoxious. I think the only reason they added that was because if it didn't have that format, it would have been redundant. It would have been just like every single other Titanic soap opera.
That's fair.
It would have
That's
just
fair.
it would have been another SOS Titanic, even though like that's kind of an insult to SOS Titanic because it
Eh.
has some semblance of historical accuracy. It's I'm biased, obviously.
Meh.
It's it's just another 96 miniseries. I'm also pretty sure Julian Fellows took notes from the 96 miniseries because
Probably.
there's some parallels. The Allisons are in it, the Allison family,
Hmm.
the dancing in first class, although they're not the first or the last
That
ones to do that.
was that. Anyone who listens to me and Gally talking about the mini series will hear me complain about just like there were so many things that were, as you said, people lean into these certain tropes and what have you, but there were so many things that were just so outside of being accurate that it was kind of Not like,
like that weird lounge, writing
yeah,
room, smoking
smoking
room,
room,
reception room
casino.
combo. Yeah, I swear it looks like it was somebody's house in Budapest. Like, I think they just went. I mean, it did kind of look a little bit like some of the alcoves did remind me of the actual lounge, but
Sure,
looking closer, I think I mean, I could be wrong. I have been wrong about these things before, but usually not when it comes to like where things are filmed. It looks they filmed it in Budapest, for because it's cheaper.
interesting.
Um, yeah. So yeah, the whole thing was just filmed inside a studio, like a giant studio tank.
You can tell. And
Um,
there's a YouTuber that I really like called named Jamie French, and one of the things she likes to say about like low budget things is that when you can tell that it's filmed on a soundstage, she calls it a SETI set. Like it's a really SETI set.
Oh no, it's super steady. And
Yeah.
what I love about the exterior set is how everybody just gave up on it at some point while filming. Because if you watch it, it was supposed to be this weird, bland, generic quarter of Titanic
Mhm.
of like boat deck and a deck, and it was supposed to be just generic enough. So if you add little props to it, little bits and pieces, it can change what part of the ship it's at. It could be forward with the bridge.
Right.
It could be aft. It
Hmm.
could be port side. It could be starboard side. All depends on where you like, where you rearrange the little pieces. But it seems they sort of just like somewhere during like the actual production and the editing, they just like gave up trying to figure out where the hell the pass like the characters are supposed to be standing.
Hmm.
So for example, in that scene where the daughter Manton, God, the family
Yes.
was awful. When she
Georgiana.
Georgiana, she's flirting with Harry Widener.
Yes.
That scene always gives me epilepsy with seizures. Because if you watch it carefully, you know what a fashion plate is? I just learned that word actually fairly recently.
I'm Googling it to pretend
Um,
like I know what it is.
okay, the on the Titanic, the curve, the A deck where it curves like at the beginning of the deck, like it's open like on the Olympic,
Uh-huh.
but then it kind of curves up and turns into the
Ah,
windows.
I
See what I
see.
mean?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, on the A deck and B deck on Titanic. On Olympic, it
Perfect.
was just on B deck. So they're called fashion plates, where it kind of stylistically curves up, so it looks like a smoother transition, and not just like it abruptly turns into windows. So that little curve, if you watch the scene, that curve keeps switching from behind her, from behind the girl, and then behind Harry Widener. It
You're right. I am now remembering, even I didn't know what it was called. I didn't know it was called the fashion plate, but I noticed in my brain, I was just like, that beam keeps moving.
Yes, that's it's so it's like they're either keep like in between dialogue, they starting out like they say something at the front of a deck and then they run all the way to the middle where it like where the enclosure ends where the enclosure ends and they're like in the open space, or they either just keep flopping back and forth between port side and starboard side. Either way, it's stupid. Kind of
A little.
like if you watch Rosa's on the live, I guess we should say, unaliving attempt, how she starts running. Oh, I dropped my microphone. How
Woo!
she starts running down a deck to the stern, and then it
Uh-huh.
puts her on the deck. The only way for that to work is for her to run all the way to the end of a deck, run into the port side veranda cafe
Okay.
through the revolving door into the smoking room, then run all the way back through the ship to the grand staircase, then go up to A deck, then not A deck, all the way. So run all the way down. Basically, okay, so she's in the smoking room. Then she
Hmm.
has to run all the way down A deck to the front grand staircase, to the floor grand staircase, go all the way up to the boat deck, start running aft, hop through several like waste gates, partitioning the boat deck, the engineer promenade, second class, get her butt over to second class promenade, go into the second class staircase, climb the stairs or take the elevator down to B deck, and then she can exit onto that aft B deck promenade and continue to the poop deck. That's the only way on the ship. If you look at the blueprints, she could magically teleport from, well, it's either magical teleportation from A deck to B deck, or she had to make that trip. Like she was just really confused and realized that she needs to go back to the front of the ship and then try again through boat deck.
So what you're telling me is that Rose Dewitt Bukater is the first Usain Bolt.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
And
We solved that
they,
mystery.
basically what I'm saying is, without that magical, Hollywood movie cut from her running
Yes.
from A deck to B deck, for her to go from where she was on A deck down to that B deck, the way first class is laid out, she would have to do like an early version of parkour.
Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that I am sort of like, that's the sort of movie magic cinema making moment that I'm kind of okay with.
No, yeah, I didn't. I never. No, I didn't even notice that until like halfway through my life.
Sure. I mean, well, all I was gonna say was like to me, it's like even though you would might know that's correct, it's one of those things where like, okay, but to make it accurate, that scene would have been like 15 minutes long, and that's super boring. And then by the time she got there, she'd just be too tired. She'd be like,
It's like I don't even want to kill myself anymore.
I got really lost getting down here. Right, I feel like I was just like way too tired.
Okay, now I'm ready. Try to talk me.
Just say this in 2 minutes. These heels are horrible. Yeah, it
Well, yeah,
wouldn't
the
be
thing about
dramatic.
what I always actually said about Titanic movies, and even The Night to Remember has shades of that, is every Titanic movie is essentially a really protracted episode of the Love Boat, except everybody dies in the end.
So it's just morbid love boat.
Yeah, like a very morbid. And there was actually, and years later, after I made that observation, I managed to catch a sketch, like an old sketch from, you remember that show Mad TV?
Yeah.
They had this. I can't find it anymore, and if I ever find it, I would have to download it. It's hilarious. They did like the Love Titanic. They did like a Love Boat episode set on the Titanic. And then when the ship sinks, instead of the Love Titanic, they're on the Lifeboat. And the theme is like the Lifeboat.
Oh, that's
And
awesome.
it was just meant to be a stupid like joke, a stupid parody, but they had no idea how right they were, how on the nose they were by making an allusion between Titanic and the Love Boat, because every Titanic movie is basically an episode of the Love Boat. If anything, the James Cameron movie stands out in that he did have multiple subplots happening around Jack and Rose,
Yeah.
and he cut them down, he cut them out, and focused on just a single story. Because most other Titanic movies are basically soap operas, love episodes, because there's never really one main character. It's kind of just all over the place.
Hmm.
If you're thinking about that.
Oh, I don't know if this is it, but I think I may have found something. Is this it?
It's back up.
I just sent you. Is this it? The Titanic Love Boat, Mad TV. Is this it?
Oh my gosh, yes.
That's
It was
it.
like gone. It was gone for years.
Oh, it was only put up 3 weeks ago, so I guess maybe they finally got safe enough for it to come back. It's online. Okay, it may not be online forever, y'all, but currently right
So
now.
go Titanic Love Boat Mad TV, watch it. You
Yeah.
will not, especially if you're obsessed with Titanic movies and tropes like we are, you will not
Yes.
regret it.
Okay, I've never
Because
seen it, but I'm gonna watch it when we're
it's
done.
it's just funny that like they're thinking that this is like they think they're just doing this absurdist random humor that has no basis in reality,
Right.
but it totally does.
I'm excited to watch it. No, it is always frustrating when you're looking for a like a YouTube clip or like a clip from back in the day where you're like, I know it was online. I know it was online. And then it's just
Oh yeah,
gone.
there's a Pizza Hut training video I've been trying to find for over a year now
A
that I used
Pizza
to
Hut
watch.
fainting?
Training
Oh,
training video fainting
like who the hell is
about how to
passing out?
well, back when they served beer and stuff, I guess you could
Oh,
get
that
something.
is a fair point. I could see someone drinking a beer and
I
eating one of
wasn't,
their terrible pasta dishes and just dying on the spot.
but yeah, no, it was hilarious. It was a training video from the '80s on how to serve drinks and do the salad bar because they back when they had like brick and mortar stores and restaurants.
Yeah.
And I just love that. I mean, that we're going to talk about that later, but like that, it was the best training video of all time.
That's
Excuse me, are those glasses beer clean? Yes, they are. And I'm like, oh, that's like an actual industry term.
an
Interesting.
actual industry. There's always a weird industry.
Not an industry term.
Ah,
Beer clean.
yes, that's true.
But was the most beloved boat like Titanic movie would actually have to be SOS Titanic, just in the way all of the characters and passengers are behaving is just. I know we were just discussing how they act way too uptight.
Yeah, a little.
Uh, um, they act way too. Oh, it looks like you found something. Let's see if it's the same one that
I
got
was
taken
this
down.
I all I did was Google Pizza Hut training video salad
When did it?
drinks.
When did it go back up?
This went online 6 months ago.
Maybe it was just like put on private.
Who
But
knows?
anyway, who knows? But back to Titanic.
Yes, SOS Titanic.
So I saw this Titanic. I know we spent like the time. We just spent some time talking about how Titanic movies kind of make characters too like tight, too uptight, too tightly wound. They're always like unhappy and complaining, and talking about socio-political turmoils. Nobody's actually relaxing. Uh, in some ways, SOS Titanic is almost like an overcorrection of that.
Okay.
Those people are just way too casual. They're just there's way too much relaxing. There's way too much jovial dancing, which is it's just in an old Titanic film almost.
Yeah,
Except James
I
Cameron, I think, and James Cameron and I don't remember. But there's all this really bizarre, like one of the most bizarre things in that movie, aside from that, I call it sci-fi water, because when the ship sinks, they're just kind of just spraying people down with a fire hose. So it's like the water is like coming inside, instead of like logically flooding going up, the
right.
water that just defies the laws of nature and just like showers them, comes in sideways, like it's like almost like there's a riot control like pyros. So that was a weird thing in that movie. And the other weird thing is that everybody is constantly sunbathing because they filmed the sailing scenes upstairs were filmed mostly on the Queen Mary, and they just Queen Mary had a lot more deck space than Titanic, so I guess they were just trying to fill out the deck space.
Sure.
So in many scenes, there are all these extras sitting around on deck chairs, which is hilarious because nobody told them that back then deck chairs weren't free; you had to pay for them. So there wouldn't be as many people like the deck chairs. If you had to pay for a deck chair, I think like they're on modern cruise ships, there wouldn't be half as many people trying to get a deck chair. So so they had those deck chairs. So there were all these people sunbathing, like it's a modern, like it's a carnival cruise, like it's a princess cruise.
Mm-hmm.
It was just kind of like, it was just so randomly anachronistic. I mean, they were wearing 1912 style clothing, but they were behaving like they were on a Bahamas cruise. Like they were just like, it was just bizarre. Kind of like if you watch the 1953 version, in the way people talk and interact, aside from Clifton Brown, because he's perfect as a snotty upperclassman,
Yes.
which is like literally his life. It seems that it was written. I know who wrote it. They're award-winning writers, but it seems their only exposure to ocean travel was like a Hawaii cruise.
Yeah, that's where I get all my inspiration when I'm trying to write historical fiction. Like when I want to write about King Henry VIII, I just go to Cozumel for a while. It really inspires me.
Yeah, it's just all the intrigue. No, but I think that it was 1952 when the film was made. It was released in
Sure.
'53. I guess it was more like you know what? Like it's a look. I sailed on a ship and this happened. Close enough.
Right.
It just kind of feels like it's just another. I guess the 1953 version and SOS Titanic, they're like the only two movies, the fictionalized kind, where passengers aren't miserable the entire time, but in the worst way possible, that they turn the whole thing into a modern pleasure cruise. Like,
Mm.
it's hard to explain. It's not like they're actually saying, oh, we're in a modern pleasure cruise. No, that's not what I'm saying. It's just the vibe it gives off, like the way the characters interact,
Right.
the way they talk. It just feels like it doesn't feel like like you're not on this for pleasure. This is like how you get home to America. This
Hmm.
is like for example, Molly Brown is always shown to be having way too much fun on the Titanic. In reality, she was kind of beside herself. She was sailing back to Denver, which is where I live.
Okay.
She was sailing back to Denver. I mean, she was obviously going to take a train after they docked in New
Hmm.
York because her grandson was sick, and
Yes.
she was trying to get home to her grandson. So I don't think she would be as frolicky as she is in all the movies, or
No,
especially in the '96 miniseries.
it takes a lot of liberties with that as a concept because it'd be a little hard, I think, in making a lot of TV and movie to explain, well, actually she's here but it's not for good reasons, etc. So it's like that's one of those things where it's like I can see where the artistic filmmaking at the time, but as you
And the
said it.
same thing with.
Mhm.
Oh no, no, go ahead. Sorry, I'm just
all I
interrupting.
was gonna say was that it's just like it takes a little too long to explain stuff like that in a movie,
It's
so
true. For example, that's why the Strausses are always like a weird. I'm Jewish.
yeah.
And there's, I always have like a lot of issues with how a lot of times Jews, historical Jews, are portrayed in films. Even if it's not as a villain, it's still there's always some iffy stuff going on.
Yes.
My issue, I mean, I talked with Joshua Noble about it. He's a kind of he's a Titanic historian as well.
Hmm.
He sort of kind of opened my eyes and put it into a kind of a new context. But I'm always bothered by the portrayal of the Strausses because in most films they're portrayed like they're fleeing Anatevka. Um, Anatevka, that's the village from Fiddler on the Roof.
Yes.
They're always portrayed as this like Hasidic couple of yentas. Well, not always, just most of the
A
time.
lot of the time.
Even the deleted scene in the James Cameron film also created that. They
Hmm.
always cast like the most like. I mean, I don't even know how they even cast it. Like, those who look like super duper Jewish, like if you look like you could be like that, you could have been a supporting cast member on The Nanny. Like, please, like come along, come to us. Like they always find the most Jewish looking actors, and then they have them do these like really thick Yiddish accents when they talk.
Yeah.
And in reality, first of all, to have the Yiddish accent, you have to be a Russian Jew, you have to be from the Russian Empire. Not every single Jew from Europe spoke Yiddish. It was not Russian Empire.
Yeah.
Like they were German Jews. They would have had German accents, except they wouldn't have had German accents. They both immigrated to America since they were little, like since they were children, and they grew up in America. They would have not really the accents would have fallen away. If
Hmm.
anything, Isidore Strauss grew up in Georgia. Fun fact: I think he was on the Confederate side during the Civil War.
Ooh.
But then again, so was everybody else.
Right. So it's half of everyone in history.
Yeah, it's serious. I mean, now we're like, oh yeah, they were the bad guys, but back then we didn't.
You would be like, yeah, let's hear him out.
I mean, it's terrible what they're doing, but
Yeah.
like one, it's like, yeah, one, it's like, what's that song from Evita? Like one shifts left to right, like something about every side. Anyway, it's like that. It was like that. But anyway, so he would have had a southern accent. He was from Georgia. At best, he would have had plus. But they were. I don't even think they would have had that. They were a pair of wealthy, assimilated, affluent New Yorkers.
Yes.
Assimilated. It's kind of a. it has become since a derogatory term. It's when a Jewish person like turns basically into a wasp.
I know what you it goes back to the whole thing we were talking about earlier about ethnic passing. It's cultural passing.
Yes, exactly. So they would not have been going like. Can you imagine their own Macy's? They're in politics.
Yeah.
Um, uh, can you imagine them going around Titanic like a couple of busybodies? Oi, vey, oi, 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 oi. It's just ridiculous. You know, just to even, it's just such a ridiculous thing to like even comprehend. But then Josh explained to me that well, they're supposed to be Jewish characters, unless you watch the 1953 version where they're singing "Good Near My God to Thee."
Yeah.
Although I guess if I was about to, I probably wouldn't even care what I had to sing. So you have to telegraph that they're Jewish, but you can't like oh yes, we're Jewish, but we're German Jews, so we don't really have a Yiddish accent, and we're actually not really religious, but yeah, we're Jewish. You see, like that would just sound stupid. So they have to telegraph them being Jewish somehow, and sadly, they have to rely on these like borderline anti-Semitic tropes of like Jewish stereotyping to show
Yeah.
that they're Jewish. There was actually a TV show from the early 50s. It's on YouTube. It was an anthology show called Telephone Time. No idea why. Don't even ask me why. I gave up trying to find out why it was called that. I took so many deep dives, rabbit holes, could never figure it out. So it was an anthology show in the 50s called Telephone Time. And they usually did like biographies of like famous American folk heroes. And they did an episode on Molly Brown. It was like a brief like recap of her life. Most of it took place on Titanic. And then Telephone Time, they had Molly Brown hang out with the Strausses on the Titanic. And naturally, since it's a cheap American TV show from the 50s, all of the footage of Titanic sailing and the crowd scenes and the sinking and the dining room and the water effects was naturally cut together from the 1943 Nazi version. That's like
Right.
everything you see in like all the 50s, 60s TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, so when the ship starts, so yeah, anyway, once the ship starts sinking with all the stock footage from the Nazi film version, the Strausses do something that to this day I cannot comprehend why the scriptwriter even thought that would be a good idea to do that. So the ship is sinking, and they're going to decide to die with dignity, like in real life.
Mm-hmm.
So they go, the Isidore and Ida Strauss, they go to their cabin, where he takes out a rabbi costume because that's what we Jews do. We sail and fly with a rabbi costume on hand in case there's an emergency. So he puts on his rabbi garb and takes out a gigantic Torah scroll, which is something we Jews also carry with us in case of an emergency. And they start reading the Kaddish or something. They start reading from the giant Torah scroll with him dressed as a rabbi. And I'm just like watching it with my jaw dropped. And I'm just like thinking, I don't think that ever. I don't even think you could bring those Torah scrolls with you outside a synagogue. But yeah, like that dramatization kind of went overboard, trying to show that they were Jewish with a white, waspy 1950s American names. And well, that was redundant because wasp implies the boy.
Right.
And you know who played Molly Brown in that episode? It was Forrest Fleishman, who 25 years later or so, no, 22 years later, she would play Molly Brown in SOS Titanic.
That's
There's
correct.
so much overlapping with Titanic actors. It's actually kind of because I don't think it's just I wouldn't say it's eerie or ironic. It's just that the Titanic story has been filmed so many times over and over and over. This type of overlapping has to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I normally ask people to tell me their Titanic stories, but yeah, I'm planning on having you come back on the show to do the Titanic like movies and TV stuff with me. So I think I want to save that for the next time I have you on. But was there anything else you wanted to let the listeners know before your first ever appearance on the show wraps up?
I guess if you want to hear more about my ranting about Titanic cinema, you can always pick up either the DVD or Blu-ray. So that's Titanic. It was released by Kino Lorber, and it contains the theatrical version, which is the shorter version. But they also managed to find the long lost TV version, the one that's 2.5 hours. Turns out Disney was hiding it. But yeah, like, so if you want to hear more of me talk about that stuff, just pick up the SOS Titanic Blu-ray or DVD and hit the commentary option and have fun.
Yes, I highly recommend you do that, and I highly recommend that you come back when Yev's back on the talk line, because he will be.
Yes, I would love to come back. Thank you so much.
That's a promise and a threat to anyone who's listening. He'll be back.
You can get rid of me that easy.
See? All right. Well, until next time. Bye, everyone.
Have a good one.